I was standing barefoot in my Chicago condo when I sent my younger brother exactly $1, not 10, not a joke amount that could be explained away. One single dollar, public, visible to everyone in our family Venmo feed. I watched the confirmation flash on my screen, felt the faint buzz in my hand, and for a brief second the apartment was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator kick on behind me. Then my phone started vibrating like it was alive. I did not look at it right away. I already knew what was coming. I had imagined this moment too many times over the last 2 weeks. The outrage, the disbelief, the way my name would suddenly light up every screen in my family group chat like a crime scene. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was settling into a Friday night. Traffic lights blinking, a train rattling somewhere in the distance, people heading out to dinner, laughing, living lives that did not include being dragged back into the same family role they thought they had outgrown decades ago. I finally turned the phone face up on the counter. Missed calls, 3, then 5, then 10, text bubbles stacking on top of each other so fast I could not read them even if I wanted to. The group chat name changed twice in under a minute. Someone added an aunt I had not spoken to since my 30s. Someone else reacted with angry faces before any words even landed. I took a slow breath and leaned my hips against the kitchen island. This was not impulsive. That was the part none of them would understand. This was not anger in the moment or revenge for the sake of revenge. This was a decision that had been building for years, maybe my entire adult life. But it crystallized 2 weeks ago when my mother looked me in the eye and told me I did not get to say no. I am 41 years old. I run a logistics software company with offices in 3 states. I pay my own mortgage. I sign my own contracts. I make decisions every day that affect hundreds of employees and clients. And still, in my family, I am the responsible one who is expected to comply. The phone rang again. I flipped it over this time, face down, and walked to the window. From 30 floors up, Chicago looked distant and orderly. Lines of light, a city that did not care who owed whom or which daughter was supposed to save which son. I pressed my palm to the glass and felt the cold through my skin. I knew what Daniel would be saying right now. I could hear his voice without picking up the phone. Laura, what the hell is this? Are you serious? You cannot do this. You owe us. The word owe had been thrown at me more times than I could count. Owe your parents. Owe your family. Owe your brother for being born after you. Owe us for everything we gave you. It never mattered that I had paid my own way since I was a teenager. It never mattered that I had asked for almost nothing. Owing was permanent. It was baked into my role. I poured myself a glass of water, hands steady, and finally checked one message. Not Daniel, my mother. How could you humiliate your brother like this? I closed the app without responding. What none of them knew yet was that the dollar was not the beginning. It was the end of something that started a long time ago. Back when $35,000 was enough to get me laughed out of my parents' kitchen and labeled selfish for even asking. Another vibration. This one rattled against the counter. A call from my father. I let it ring. 2 weeks earlier, they had been sitting right where I was standing now. My parents do not visit Chicago often. They say it makes them uncomfortable, too big, too loud, too many people who do not know them. When the intercom buzzed that night, I assumed it was a delivery I forgot about. Instead, my building manager said my family was here. All of them. They came in wet from the rain. My mother first, already emotional. My father close behind her, shoulders hunched like he was bracing for something. Daniel walked in last with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and decided the outcome in advance. He did not sit down. He paced. My mother cried almost immediately. My father waited until the binders came out. They had come prepared. Charts, numbers, leases. A plan for Daniel to finally do something big, something worthy. Something that required $9 million in outside funding and a personal guarantee. Something that somehow landed squarely on my shoulders. You are doing so well now, my mother said that night. Helping family should not hurt you. I remember looking at her hands as she said it. The same hands that had waved me off years ago when I asked for $35,000 to build my first prototype. The same hands that had told me girls should be careful with big risks. That stability mattered more than dreams. I remember Daniel leaning against my counter, smiling like this was already settled. Come on, Laura, this is nothing to you. Nothing. That word stayed with me. I had said no, calmly, clearly, without drama, and the room had changed. Faces hardened, voices sharpened. The word selfish came back. Louder this time. Ungrateful, cold, unreasonable. You do not get to say no. Daniel told me. You are the older sister. This is your responsibility. That was the moment something inside me snapped cleanly in half. Back in the present, my phone vibrated again. A new message came through despite the growing list of blocked numbers. You have destroyed this family. I stared at the screen for a long second, then set the phone down and walked to the living room. The silence felt heavy, but it was also clean. No one was demanding anything from me in this moment. No one was waiting for an explanation. I had done the thing I was never supposed to do. I had made my boundary visible. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, my life had just shifted in a way I knew would never be undone. Whatever came next, whatever fallout followed, whatever stories they told about me in rooms I would never enter again. There was one truth I could finally admit to myself. I was done being the responsible one for everyone but me. I picked up my phone one last time and watched the notifications stack up without opening a single one. Somewhere in Ohio, my family was losing their minds over $1. Here in Chicago, I stood still, breathing, waiting for the weight of it all to settle. And it did not feel like regret. It felt like the quiet before something irreversible. The quiet did not scare me because I had lived inside it once before. It was the same kind of quiet I felt the night I drove back to my apartment in Columbus, more than a decade earlier, gripping the steering wheel too tightly, replaying my mother's laugh in my head like it was stuck on a loop. That was the night $35,000 turned me into the selfish daughter. Back then, I was 29 and convinced I was doing something brave. I had spent months working nights and weekends on a logistics idea that made sense to me in a way nothing else ever had. Small businesses were bleeding money to shipping inefficiencies, and I believed I could build a platform that actually helped them. I was not chasing some fantasy. I had spreadsheets, market research, a basic prototype sketched out on paper. I needed seed money to hire a developer and rent a tiny office. $35,000 was not nothing, but it was not outrageous either. I waited until a Sunday afternoon to bring it up because Sundays were when my parents were in their best moods. Dinner had just finished. The table was still cluttered with plates and half-empty glasses. My father sat back in his chair rubbing his stomach. My mother was collecting napkins, already halfway distracted. Daniel was there too, stretched out on the couch, scrolling through his phone, shoes still on like he owned the place. I remember smoothing the folder in front of me before I spoke. I remember how my hands shook and how I hated myself for it. I told them I had an idea. I told them I had done the math. I told them exactly what the money would be used for. I slid the folder across the table toward my mother and waited for her to open it. She did not. Instead, she let out a short laugh, the kind that was more reflex than humor. She shook her head and said, I was always like this, always overthinking, always trying to make things complicated. She said $35,000 was a lot of money to gamble on something so uncertain. She said it sounded selfish to ask them to risk their savings on my idea when Daniel would need help someday too. Selfish. That was the word she landed on first. My father shifted in his chair and looked at the table instead of at me. He said he just wanted what was best for everyone. He said I had always been responsible and would figure it out on my own. He said Daniel was different and needed more support. Daniel did not even look up from his phone. I tried to explain that I was not asking for a handout. I talked about equity, about repayment, about how this was a real business opportunity. My mother waved her hand like she was brushing away a fly and said girls should be careful with big risks. She said stability mattered more. She said I should focus on my career and not chase pipe dreams. Pipe dreams. I remember how that phrase stung more than the money part. When I finally stopped talking, the room felt heavy. No one asked to see the numbers. No one opened the folder. My mother started talking about something else entirely, already done with the conversation. Daniel laughed from the couch and said I would be fine. I always was. I picked up the folder and stood there for a moment, waiting for someone to stop me. No one did. I left my parents' house that evening, with the folder still closed, and a hollow feeling in my chest that took years to name. It was not disappointment. It was the realization that I was not asking to be believed. I was asking to be valued. And that was not something they were willing to give. What made it worse was how ordinary it all felt. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet dismissal that told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how easily the word selfish had come to her, how quickly my ambition had been reframed as a character flaw. I wondered if she would have used that word if Daniel had been the one asking. The answer came over the next few years without needing to be spoken. Daniel dropped out of his second job not long after that because his manager did not appreciate his ideas. My parents covered his rent for 3 months while he figured things out. He talked about starting a business of his own, something vague and undefined. And my mother listened with pride. She told relatives he just needed the right opportunity. When I stopped bringing my work up at family dinners, no one noticed. I figured it out anyway, not because I was stronger than them, but because I did not have another option. A few months after that dinner, my grandmother passed and left me a small inheritance. It was not life-changing money, but it was enough to get started. I called Emily, who had been sleeping on friends' couches after leaving a corporate job that made her miserable, and told her we were doing this. We worked out of a cramped space above a dry cleaner. We ate takeout on folding chairs. We made mistakes and fixed them. I learned how to ask for help without asking my family. I learned how to trust my own judgment even when it scared me. And through all of it, the word selfish stayed with me. It followed me into meetings where investors asked who was backing me. It followed me into moments of doubt when a deal fell through or a product launch went sideways. It followed me every time my mother asked how work was going in that careful tone that told me she was waiting for me to admit failure. I never did. I built Northway Solutions piece by piece. I earned every inch of it. By the time the company started gaining real traction, my parents had stopped asking questions. They were polite, distant, comfortable in the assumption that I would always be fine. Until I was more than fine. When I moved to Chicago and sold my first major stake, the shift was immediate. Suddenly my phone rang more often. My mother wanted updates. My father asked about my plans. Daniel started calling me sis again, like we were close. I recognized the pattern even then. Success had a way of rewriting history in my family. Standing in my condo now, years later, I could see how clearly that moment at the kitchen table had set everything in motion. $35,000 had never been about the money. It had been a test of who mattered and who was expected to manage without. My phone buzzed again on the counter. I did not pick it up. I did not need to. I knew exactly why the dollar had hit them so hard. It was not the amount. It was the mirror. For the first time, I had reflected their values back to them in a language they understood. I turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the living room, letting the memory settle where it belonged. Somewhere deep down, the 29-year-old version of me who had stood in that kitchen with a closed folder finally felt seen, and that was enough to let the rest of the story unfold. That feeling did not come from nowhere. It had been forming long before I ever walked into that kitchen with a folder in my hands. I had been the responsible one for as long as I could remember. Not because I wanted to be, but because someone always needed me to be. When I was a kid in Columbus, my parents liked to tell people I was mature for my age. They said it like a compliment, but it always landed like a sentence. Mature meant I noticed things early. It meant I paid attention to moods. It meant I learned how to adjust myself so the room stayed calm. Daniel was 5 years younger than me, and from the moment he arrived, the gravity in our house shifted. He was charming, restless, and loud in a way that drew attention without effort. When he made a mess, it was because he was creative. When he talked back, it was because he was passionate. When he failed, it was because the world had not recognized his potential yet. When I did well, it was expected. I remember being 10 years old and packing my own lunch while my mother fussed over Daniel at the table, cutting his toast into neat squares because he liked it that way. I remember walking to school alone while my father drove Daniel because he had soccer practice later, and it was easier. No one ever asked if I minded. They assumed I did not. In middle school, I stayed up late finishing assignments and got praised for my discipline. Daniel forgot his homework, and my mother marched into the school to explain how sensitive he was and how the pressure affected him. Teachers nodded sympathetically. I learned early that my competence made me invisible. There was a moment in high school that still sticks with me because it was so small and so clear. I had been accepted into a summer program that could have helped me with college applications. It cost a few $1,000s. I brought the letter home, heart racing, convinced this would be different. My mother skimmed it and said we would talk about it later. That same week, Daniel broke his bike doing something reckless. My father took him to the store and bought him a new one. No discussion, no later, just immediate action. When I finally asked about the program again, my mother sighed and said money was tight, and I would understand someday. She told me I was strong enough to handle disappointment. Daniel rode past the house that afternoon on his new bike, grinning. By the time we were adults, the pattern was so familiar it felt permanent. Daniel drifted from job to job, always with a reason that made sense to my parents. Managers did not get him. The timing was wrong. He was meant for something bigger. My parents filled in the gaps with their support and their faith in his future. I built my life carefully. I worked through college. I chose safe apartments. I paid my own bills. When I succeeded, it was framed as proof that I did not need help. When Daniel struggled, it was framed as proof that he did. There was one conversation in my mid-20s that crystallized everything for me. We were sitting in my parents' living room and my father mentioned, almost casually, that they were thinking of taking out a small loan to help Daniel with a business idea. I asked what the idea was. No one could quite explain it. It involved something with food and maybe a storefront. I asked how much they were thinking. My mother waved her hand and said it was not important. Daniel needed a chance. I remember feeling my chest tighten. I asked if they would have done the same for me. My mother looked genuinely confused by the question. She said I did not need chances. I made my own. That was when I understood that the roles were not accidental. They were necessary to keep the family story intact. Daniel was the dreamer who needed saving. I was the stable one who would not collapse if ignored. It was easier for everyone that way. Even after I moved out and started building my career, the dynamic followed us. At holidays, Daniel was asked about his plans, his ideas, his next big move. I was asked if I was tired, if I was working too much, if I had thought about settling down. My achievements were acknowledged politely and then set aside. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was being petty. I told myself family was complicated, and this was just how it worked. But there was a cost to carrying that role for so long. It taught me to doubt my own needs. It taught me to minimize my ambition. It taught me that asking for support was a moral failing. When my mother called my request for $35,000 selfish, it landed so hard because it fit the narrative perfectly. Daniel asking for help was hope. Me asking for help was greed. I could see now how that moment had been inevitable. Years later, when Daniel stood in my Chicago condo and told me I owed him, it was the same story in a louder voice. He did not see a successful sister who had built something from nothing. He saw a resource that had finally accumulated enough value to be tapped. My parents saw it too, even if they would never say it out loud. Their faith in Daniel had not changed. Their expectations of me had not softened. They had simply scaled with my success. Standing alone in my living room after sending that dollar, I thought about all the times I had swallowed resentment because it felt easier than confrontation. All the times I had stepped in quietly to fix things. All the times I had been praised for being easy. Being easy had gotten me here, but it had also trapped me in a role that never evolved. I walked to the window again and watched a couple cross the street below, arguing lightly about where to eat. Ordinary problems, manageable problems. The kind that did not come with decades of unspoken obligation attached. I realized then that this story was not just about money or favoritism or even betrayal. It was about identity, about the moment when the responsible daughter finally refused to play her part. My phone had gone quiet now, either because everyone was busy talking to each other or because they had run out of words that would reach me. The silence felt different than before, less fragile, more settled. I poured myself another glass of water and sat down on the couch, letting the memories line up in my mind without fighting them. There was sadness there, yes, but also clarity. I had not imagined the imbalance, I had lived it. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to make peace with it. I sat there for a while, listening to the hum of the city, knowing that the next part of the story would not be about proving myself anymore, but about building something with no safety net at all. That thought did not scare me. It felt familiar. It felt familiar because I had already learned how to build things without anyone catching me if I fell. The months after I left my parents' house were quiet in a way that forced me to listen to myself. There was no backup plan waiting in a drawer. No one checking in to see if I was all right. Just the idea in my head and the small inheritance my grandmother Evelyn had left me, which arrived in my account like a quiet vote of confidence from someone who had seen me clearly. It was not a fortune. It would not last long if I was careless, but it was mine. I called Emily Ross the same day the funds cleared. Emily and I had worked together briefly at a consulting firm before she burned out and walked away. She was sharp and stubborn and honest in a way that scared people who preferred comfort over truth. When I told her I wanted to build something and needed a partner who would not flinch when it got hard, she laughed and said she was already in. We found a tiny office space above a dry cleaner on the edge of downtown Columbus. The stairs smelled like detergent and old carpet. The windows rattled when trucks passed. We brought in 2 folding desks and a donated couch that sagged in the middle. It was not impressive, but it was real. The first year was a blur of long days and longer nights. We did everything ourselves because there was no one else to do it. I handled sales calls and product planning. Emily managed operations and kept us from spinning out when things went sideways. We ate takeout on paper plates and joked about how this would make a great origin story someday if we survived it. Most weeks, I was running on a few hours of sleep and pure determination. I learned how to hear no without taking it personally. I learned how to pitch to people who smiled politely and forgot my name the moment I left the room. I learned how to fix mistakes quickly because we could not afford to repeat them. There were nights when I sat alone in the office after Emily went home and wondered if my parents had been right. Not because the work was too hard, but because the loneliness was heavier than I expected. When things went wrong, there was no one to call who would tell me it was going to be okay. I had chosen independence, and independence came without a safety net. My family did not check in much during that time. When my mother did call, it was usually to ask if I was eating enough or if I had thought about finding something more stable. She mentioned Daniel often. He was working on a new idea. He just needed time. I listened and kept my answers vague. I stopped sharing details about my life because I noticed how easily they were dismissed or redirected back to Daniel. If I said we signed a new client, my mother would nod and then ask if I thought Daniel might be interested in logistics someday. If I said we were struggling, she would say that was why she worried about me taking risks. It was easier to keep things to myself. Slowly, the work began to show results. We refined the platform. We landed a handful of loyal clients who referred us to others. Word spread in small circles. It was not explosive growth, but it was steady, the kind of growth that comes from solving real problems instead of chasing headlines. The first time we paid ourselves a modest salary, Emily and I went out for drinks at a neighborhood bar. Nothing fancy, just a booth and cheap wine. We sat there laughing in disbelief, both of us aware that this was a milestone no one else would mark for us. I did not tell my parents. As the company grew, so did my sense of self. Not confidence exactly, but clarity. I stopped questioning whether I deserved to be there. I stopped minimizing my work when people asked what I did. I learned how to take up space without apologizing. That shift did not go unnoticed forever. A few years in, my mother started asking more pointed questions. How big was the company now? Was it stressful managing people? Had I thought about what came next? Her tone was careful, curious in a way that felt new. My father began to ask about numbers. Daniel started texting again, casually at first, then more often. I could feel something turning, like a weather change you sense before the clouds roll in. By the time Northway Solutions signed its first major regional contract, the distance between my family and me had become something we all pretended not to see. They were proud in a vague way, but still disconnected from the reality of my life. I visited less often. Holidays became shorter. Conversations stayed shallow. I told myself it was healthy. I told myself boundaries were a sign of growth. When the company hit a level that caught the attention of larger partners, I moved to Chicago to be closer to investors and clients. The move felt like a clean noticing of who I had become. A woman with responsibilities that extended beyond her family narrative. The calls increased after that. My mother wanted to visit. My father asked if I missed home. Daniel joked about crashing on my couch someday when he came to see the city. I smiled and deflected and kept my life compartmentalized. What I did not say out loud was that success had not softened anything between us. It had only made the imbalance more visible. Looking back, I can see how those years without a safety net prepared me for what came next. They taught me how to stand alone without falling apart. They taught me that building something meaningful often meant being misunderstood by the people who knew you longest. Sitting in my Chicago living room now, I could trace a straight line from that office above the dry cleaner to the moment my family walked in with binders and expectations. I had spent years proving I did not need them. They had spent those same years deciding that I could be used. The irony did not escape me. I turned off the lights and let the room settle into darkness, thinking about how far I had come without permission or approval. The work ahead felt heavy, but it also felt earned. I knew the next chapter would be about success and what it changed, not just for me, but for the people who had always assumed I would carry the weight. I sat there quietly, letting that thought land, aware that the calm I felt was temporary, and that the real test was still waiting. The real test arrived quietly, disguised as congratulations. It started with emails that ended in exclamation points and phone calls that came a little too early in the morning. Partners wanted meetings. Advisors wanted updates. People who had once smiled politely and passed began asking detailed questions about our roadmap. Northway Solutions was no longer a scrappy experiment. It was a company with leverage. Emily and I sat across from each other in a glass conference room one afternoon, the city humming below us, reviewing a term sheet that made my hands feel light, not dizzy, just aware. Years of careful decisions had stacked into something tangible. When we signed the first major regional deal, I drove home that night without music, letting the quiet settle around the idea that my life had crossed an invisible line. I did not call my parents. That choice felt deliberate and protective, not petty. I had learned that sharing success too early invited opinions I did not have room for. I told myself I would mention it later, when it was settled, when it could not be reframed as luck or dismissed as temporary. By the time we announced the strategic sale of a minority stake, the news reached them anyway. It always does. Someone from church mentioned it to my mother. A cousin forwarded a link. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. My mother sounded different, softer, curious in a way I had not heard in years. She asked how I was holding up with all the responsibility. She said she worried about me carrying so much on my shoulders. She said she was proud. Proud was new. My father followed up with questions about Chicago, about the cost of living, about whether the company was stable. His voice held an interest that had been absent when stability had been a concern I raised. Daniel texted that afternoon. "Congrats, sis. Knew you would make it." I stared at the message longer than I needed to. There was no mention of the years in between. No acknowledgement of the silence. Just a casual claim of foresight that cost him nothing. I replied with a thank you and put my phone down. As my life expanded, my family re-entered it carefully, like guests testing the temperature of a room. My mother asked to visit. My father suggested dinner when I was in town. Daniel joked about how cool it must be to have real meetings and real money now. I noticed how often they used the word now. At first, I enjoyed the distance I could maintain. I chose when to answer calls. I decided what to share. I had learned to keep my boundaries polite and firm. When my mother asked how much the company was worth, I deflected. When my father asked if I planned to sell outright, I said I was focused on growth. They accepted my answers, but I could feel the shift. Success had changed the way they looked at me. Not with admiration exactly, with calculation. The signs were subtle. My mother began forwarding articles about entrepreneurship. My father mentioned a neighbor whose son had opened a restaurant. Daniel started talking about ideas again. Longer messages this time, more specific. He asked about operations, about investors, about what it took to scale. I kept my responses general, encouraging but non-committal. What unsettled me was not the interest. It was the assumption underneath it. The way conversations drifted toward what I could do rather than what I had done. The way my availability was implied rather than requested. One weekend, I flew back to Ohio for a family gathering. Nothing dramatic, a birthday, cake and folding chairs in my parents' backyard. Daniel held court, animated and confident, talking about a concept he was developing, something with food, something scalable. People nodded and asked questions. My mother watched me closely as he spoke. At one point, she leaned over and said quietly that it was nice to see Daniel so motivated. She said maybe all he needed was the right support. She did not finish the sentence, but she did not need to. I smiled and excused myself to help in the kitchen. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, I felt the first real flicker of dread, not fear, recognition. I had seen this pattern before. The dreamer gathering attention, the family warming to an idea before any details existed. the expectation forming that I would step in, quietly, responsibly, because that was what I did. Back in Chicago, I mentioned it to Emily during a late meeting. I told her I felt like something was coming. She listened without interrupting, then asked a question that stopped me cold. What would happen if you said no? The answer surfaced immediately, clear and uncomfortable. They would be disappointed. They would be hurt. They would call me selfish. Emily nodded like she had expected that. She said success changes the story people tell themselves about you. She said it was better to decide your limits before someone else decided them for you. I wanted to believe that was enough, that awareness would be protection. But awareness does not stop people who feel entitled. The first real ask came a few months later, framed as curiosity. Daniel wanted to pick my brain. He wanted advice. He wanted to understand how I thought about growth. We met for coffee when he was in town. He talked about locations and branding and potential partners. He talked confidently and vaguely, like someone who had watched just enough videos to feel informed. I listened. I asked questions. I noticed how quickly he skipped over numbers and timelines. When I suggested starting smaller, he brushed it off. He said thinking small was why most people never made it. I did not argue. A week later, my mother called to tell me how excited Daniel was after our conversation. She said it meant so much to him that I believed in him. I corrected her gently. I said I had not said that. There was a pause on the line. Then she laughed and said, "Of course I did. Not in so many words. But he could tell." She said he looked up to me. The words landed heavy. From that point on, the calls came more often. Not demands, not yet. Just questions and comments that nudged the narrative forward. We have been talking about what it would take to really do this right. You have such good instincts. Family should help family. Each time, I felt the familiar pressure to smooth things over, to reassure, to be reasonable. At night, I lay awake thinking about the years it took to build what I had, the risks I absorbed alone, the nights I wondered if I was foolish for believing in myself when no one else did. I thought about how quickly all of that was being reframed as a shared asset. The imbalance I had managed so carefully was becoming visible again. By the time my mother asked if Daniel could come stay with me for a few weeks to explore opportunities, I knew we were approaching the edge. I said no, kindly, clearly. I said my schedule was full and I needed my space. Her response was immediate. She said she was disappointed. She said she thought I would understand. She said Daniel needed support. I ended the call feeling unsettled. Standing in my condo days later, watching the city lights flicker on as evening settled in, I felt the same tension I had felt years ago with a closed folder on a kitchen table. Different numbers, same expectation. Something was coming. I could feel it in the way conversations circled without landing, in the way silence followed my refusals, in the way success had turned from something I owned into something they wanted access to. I poured a glass of water and sat down, letting the realization settle. The calm I had built was not accidental. It had been earned, and it was about to be tested in a way that would make everything before it feel like preparation. I did not know yet how far they would go, but I knew I would have to decide who I was willing to disappoint. They did not call to ask if they could come. They called to tell me they were already on the way. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was in the middle of reviewing a proposal when my phone lit up with my mother's name. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my chest tightened and I answered. Her voice was bright and breathless, the way it got when she had already decided how something was going to go. She said they were driving in from Ohio and would be at my place by early evening. She said Daniel had something important to share, and it would be better to talk in person. She said it would not take long. I stood there staring out the window at the gray line of the river while she talked, realizing she had never once asked if I was available. I told her I had work and no plans to host anyone. She brushed it off and said this was family and family-made time. Then she said something that still echoes in my head. She said this was about Daniel's future, and that mattered more than schedules. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. They arrived just after 6, all of them together. My parents first, damp from the rain, my father carrying a cardboard box like it contained something fragile. Daniel followed close behind, with the kind of energy that fills a room whether you want it to or not. And then there was Chloe Hartman, his girlfriend, holding her phone like an extension of her hand, eyes already scanning my space. They did not wait to be invited in. My mother hugged me tightly, already emotional. My father nodded and said hello like this was a business meeting. Daniel smiled wide, confident, like he was walking into a place he already owned. Chloe lingered near the door, recording something quietly until Daniel nudged her. We moved into the living room and my father set the box on the table. He opened it carefully and began pulling out binders, color-coded and labeled, floor plans, financial projections, printed emails from landlords and suppliers. It was all very organized and completely surreal. Daniel did not sit down. He paced as he talked, explaining his vision with practiced enthusiasm. 3 locations to start, a concept that would scale fast. He talked about timing and opportunity and how everything was lining up. He talked like someone who had already crossed the finish line in his head. My mother watched me the whole time, her eyes shining. She nodded at the right moments. She reached for my arm when Daniel described the flagship location, squeezing lightly as if we were already in agreement. My father cleared his throat and said they had already committed some money themselves. He talked about second mortgages and retirement accounts, about how they were all in. He said they just needed one final piece to make it work. I asked how much. Daniel stopped pacing and looked straight at me. He said $9 million like it was a number he had rehearsed in the mirror. He said it casually, like he was asking to borrow a jacket. The room went very still. My mother spoke next. She said this was Daniel's chance. She said people had gifts, and his was bringing people together. She said I was doing so well now, and helping family should not hurt me. She said I could afford it. I asked what exactly they were asking for. An investment, a loan, equity, control. No one answered directly. Daniel said we could work out the details later. He said the important thing was trust. My father added that the contracts required personal guarantees and that investors wanted to see a strong family commitment. He said my involvement would make everything easier. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I looked at the binders again, at the numbers that did not quite line up, at the timelines that assumed everything would go right. I thought about the years it took me to build my company, the nights I lay awake calculating risk because no one else would catch me if I fell. I told them no. I said it calmly, clearly. I said I was not giving them $9 million, and I was not attaching my name or assets to something I did not believe in. I said I wished Daniel well, but this was not my responsibility. The shift in the room was immediate. Daniel's smile vanished. My mother's face tightened like I had slapped her. My father leaned forward and said I was being dramatic. He said this was family, and families helped each other. He said I was letting fear control me. Daniel stepped closer and said I was overthinking it. He said I had turned a small amount of money into something massive, and that proved I knew how to do this. He said $9 million was pocket change to me now. Chloe finally spoke up, still holding her phone. She said it was basically a write-off and that my brand would benefit from being associated with something like this. She said people loved a success story that stayed loyal to family. My mother started crying then. Real tears, loud and messy. She said she could not believe I would abandon my brother like this. She said after everything they had sacrificed, I owed them this. That word again, I felt myself pull back, emotionally and physically. I stepped away from the table and crossed my arms, grounding myself in the familiar weight of my own body. I said I did not owe anyone my future. I said helping someone did not mean handing over control of my life. I said they were asking too much. Daniel's voice sharpened. He said I was selfish. He said I had always been selfish. He said I had forgotten where I came from. My father tried to mediate, but his words carried the same message. He said I needed to be rational. He said this was family. He said I did not get to say no. That was when something inside me went completely quiet. I told them to leave. At first, no one moved. My mother sobbed harder. Daniel stared at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. Chloe whispered something to him. Her phone angled away now. I repeated myself and walked to the door. My hands were steady. My voice did not shake. My father stood up slowly. Disappointment etched into his face. My mother clung to his arm, still crying. Daniel lingered, his expression hardening into something ugly. He said this was not over. They left in silence, the door closing behind them with a sound that felt final. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the echo of their footsteps in the hallway. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel came through almost immediately. He said I was rich and heartless and that I was destroying the family. He said I owed them and I would regret this. I did not reply. I sank onto the couch and stared at the binders still spread across my table. $9 million. Family duty. Trust. Outside, the rain picked up again, streaking the windows and blurring the city into soft shapes. Inside, the weight of what had just happened settled over me slowly. I knew this was not the end. I could feel it. The ask had been refused, but the entitlement had not disappeared. I had drawn a line, and lines tend to provoke people who believe they should never exist. I gathered the binders and stacked them neatly by the door, not out of respect, but because chaos was no longer allowed to live in my space. As I turned off the lights and prepared for a long night ahead, one thought pressed itself forward with unsettling clarity. They had not come to ask for help. They had come to claim it. And now that they knew I would not hand it over quietly, I could already sense the pressure shifting into something darker. I sat down and waited, knowing the next wave was coming, and that it would not be gentle. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It seeped in from every direction like water finding cracks. The morning after they left, my phone was already warm when I picked it up. Missed calls from my mother, 2 from my father, 3 messages from Daniel, each one shorter and sharper than the last. I did not open them. I knew the pattern too well to pretend curiosity would help. By noon, the circle widened. An aunt I had not spoken to in years texted to say she was disappointed. A cousin sent a message that started with "Hope you are okay" and ended with "Family is everything." A woman from my parents' church left a voicemail about forgiveness and compassion, her voice gentle but weighted with judgment. I sat at my desk and stared at my inbox, trying to focus on work while a familiar sensation crept up my spine. It was the old pull, the urge to explain, to smooth things over, to absorb the discomfort so everyone else could breathe easier. I did not give in. Instead, I forwarded everything to a folder I labeled later and closed my email. By the second day, the tone shifted. Daniel stopped trying to sound hurt and started sounding angry. He accused me of humiliating him. He said I had ruined his future. He said I had always thought I was better than everyone else. My mother followed with longer messages that moved between tears and outrage. She said she did not raise me to be this cold. She said she could not sleep. She said my father was sick with worry. I listened to one voicemail by accident. Her voice cracked as she said she did not recognize me anymore. That one landed hard. I spent that evening walking the length of my apartment, replaying her words in my head, reminding myself that feeling guilty did not mean I was wrong. Still, guilt has a way of blurring lines when it is reinforced by a chorus. On the third day, Chloe escalated things. I learned about it from Emily, who forwarded me a link with a single sentence that read, "This is starting to get messy." The video was already spreading by the time I clicked it. Chloe sat in the passenger seat of a car, eyes glassy, voice shaking as she talked about betrayal. She did not name me directly, but she did not need to. She talked about a successful woman who turned her back on family when they needed her most. She talked about dreams being crushed by greed. The comments filled quickly. People took sides without knowing any facts. Some praised her strength, others called me heartless. A few tagged my company. I turned off my phone and sat very still. This was no longer just a family issue. It was becoming a public narrative, and I could see how easily it could spiral into something that affected my work. My reputation had been built carefully over years. Chloe was dismantling it in minutes with emotion and implication. That night, my father called from a number I had not blocked yet. Against my better judgment, I answered. He did not yell. That almost made it worse. He said they were under a lot of stress. He said people were talking. He said he did not understand why I was being so rigid. He said if I could just reconsider, even partially, things would calm down. I told him calmly that I had already decided. I said this was not about money. It was about boundaries. I said dragging this into public view was not okay. He sighed and said sometimes sacrifices were necessary to keep the family together. He said I was strong enough to handle the fallout. There it was again. Strength as an expectation, endurance as obligation. I hung up feeling hollow. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. It was from a lawyer I vaguely recognized as someone who had handled minor disputes for my parents' friends. The language was formal but thin. It talked about moral obligations and implied shared interest. It hinted at legal consequences without naming any. It was not a serious threat, but it was meant to scare. I called my attorney, Mark Feldman, and read it to him. He listened without interrupting, then told me exactly what it was: posturing, pressure. an attempt to make me doubt myself. He asked me if I wanted him to respond. I said not yet. What frightened me most was not the letter or the videos or the messages. It was how familiar the tactic felt. The way they layered guilt with urgency, the way they framed my refusal as cruelty, the way they treated my autonomy like an inconvenience. By the end of the week, I was exhausted in a way sleep did not fix. I moved through my days on autopilot, answering emails, attending meetings, nodding at the right moments. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the city and wondering how something so clear to me could be so unacceptable to them. Emily noticed before I said anything. She stopped by my office late one evening with takeout and closed the door behind her. She did not ask how I was doing. She just sat across from me and waited. When I finally spoke, the words came out flat. I told her I felt like I was being punished for saying no. I told her it felt like the entire weight of my family was reminding me of my place. She listened, then said something quietly that shifted the room. She said they are not upset because you said no. They are upset because you meant it. That was it. That was the truth I had been circling. They had never expected resistance. Not real resistance. They had counted on my history of compliance, my discomfort with conflict, my fear of being labeled selfish. When those tools failed, they reached for bigger ones. Public shame, legal intimidation, emotional collapse. That night, Daniel sent one last message that cut through everything else. He said I did not have the right to decide this on my own. He said as the older sister, I had responsibilities. He said I did not get to say no. I read it once, then again. Something settled inside me with unexpected calm. For the first time, I did not feel torn. I felt resolved. I turned my phone face down and walked to the window. The city lights reflected back at me, steady and indifferent. I thought about the years I had spent earning my independence, the countless small decisions that had led me here. I realized then that this moment was not about saving my family from disappointment. It was about saving myself from a future where my boundaries were always negotiable. I did not know yet how I would respond. I only knew that whatever I did next had to be final. I poured a glass of water and sat down, letting the noise fade, letting the decision take shape without rushing it. The storm outside had not passed, but something had gone very still. The decision did not arrive as a burst of courage. It arrived as a kind of quiet clarity that left no room for argument. The morning after that last message from Daniel, I woke up before my alarm and lay still, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed awake outside. For once, my mind was not racing through possible explanations or compromises. There was nothing left to negotiate. The situation had narrowed itself down to a single truth that felt almost peaceful in its simplicity. If I gave in now, I would never get out. I made coffee and stood at the counter watching the steam rise, thinking about how many times in my life I had been praised for being reasonable, how often I had been told that I was strong because I absorbed discomfort quietly, how that strength had always seemed to benefit everyone but me. By 9, I was sitting in Mark Feldman's office, a clean space with neutral walls and a view of the river that suggested order and control. Mark had been my attorney for years, guiding me through contracts and negotiations with steady precision. He greeted me with a nod and waited while I placed my phone on the table between us. I told him everything, not just the demand for $9 million, but the years leading up to it. The guilt, the pressure, the way my refusal had been treated like betrayal, the videos, the letters, the messages that insisted I did not have the right to decide my own future. Mark listened without interruption. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. He said what they were doing was not illegal, at least not yet. He said it was emotional leverage dressed up as obligation. He said if I tied my finances or name to Daniel's venture, even partially, I would expose myself to risk that could not be undone. He said family pressure had a way of turning into legal problems when money was involved. Then he asked me a question that landed harder than any accusation. He asked me what outcome I was hoping for. I thought about my parents suddenly understanding me, about Daniel accepting responsibility for his own life, about things calming down and returning to some version of normal, and then I realized how unrealistic that sounded. I told him I wanted peace. He nodded and said peace required boundaries that could not be misinterpreted. He said ambiguity was my enemy right now. He said every delay or partial response would be read as weakness. On the way back to my office, I walked instead of taking a car. The air was sharp and clear. the kind that makes you feel present in your body. With every step, I felt more grounded, more resolved. At work, I made a list. It was not dramatic, just practical. I wrote down everything that needed to be secured: accounts, access, communication channels. I spoke with my IT team about tightening permissions. I told my assistant to hold all family calls. I changed the settings on my social media to limit tagging and comments. Each small action felt like laying a brick in a wall I should have built years ago. That afternoon, Emily stopped by my office. She could tell something had shifted. I told her I had decided to end the conversation entirely. No more explanations, no more back and forth. She did not question it. She asked how she could help. That night, alone in my condo, I went through my phone and read the messages I had avoided. My mother's words swung wildly between heartbreak and indignation. My father's messages appealed to reason while quietly reinforcing the same expectation. Daniel's were blunt and furious. "You owe us. You always have." I did not respond. Instead, I sat on the couch and let myself remember the younger version of me who had learned to smooth things over before they escalated. The one who believed that if she could just explain herself clearly enough, people would understand. I saw how tired she was, how long she had been carrying everyone else's discomfort. I realized then that my silence was already being filled with their assumptions. If they were going to tell a story about me no matter what I did, I might as well stop trying to control it. The idea formed slowly and then all at once. It was not about punishment, it was about clarity. I opened Venmo and searched for Daniel's name. His profile picture was the same as always, smiling, confident, untroubled. I stared at it for a long moment, thinking about all the money that had flowed quietly toward him over the years, the support that had never required a plan or proof. I did not type anything yet. Instead, I stood up and walked through my apartment, turning off lights, closing doors, grounding myself in the space that was entirely mine. I thought about how carefully I had built this life, how much of it existed because I had learned to rely on myself when no one else would. By the time I sat back down, the decision felt complete. This was not an emotional reaction. It was a boundary expressed in a language they could not twist. A response that did not invite debate. I typed the amount slowly, $1. My finger hovered over the screen while I considered what it would mean once it was done. The fallout, the anger, the certainty that there would be no going back. I felt surprisingly calm. Outside, the sky darkened into evening. The city lights flickered on one by one, indifferent to family drama and moral arguments somewhere far away. My parents were likely talking about me. Daniel was probably pacing, rehearsing what he would say next. I exhaled and rested my thumb against the glass. I was not afraid of what they would think anymore. I was ready for the moment when everything became unmistakably clear. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not in doubt, but in acceptance, and held there, knowing that the next movement would change the shape of the story permanently. I opened my eyes, and the room felt different, like it was holding its breath with me. My thumb pressed down, and the confirmation appeared almost instantly. The app chimed softly, cheerful and oblivious. $1 sent. Public. Final. I watched the screen for a second longer than necessary, then set the phone face down on the coffee table. Nothing happened at first. The city outside my windows moved along as if nothing monumental had just occurred. A bus hissed to a stop below. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. I stood there barefoot on the rug, waiting for the impact I knew was coming. It took less than 30 seconds. The phone began to vibrate, sharp and relentless, skittering across the glass surface until I caught it with my palm. Notifications stacked faster than I could read them. Missed calls appeared in a neat column, my mother first, then my father, then Daniel over and over again. The family group chat lit up like a flare. I did not open it. Instead, I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I took a slow sip and leaned against the counter, listening to the buzz of my phone echo through the apartment. When I finally picked it up, I scrolled through the notifications without clicking into any of them. Angry faces, question marks. Someone had reacted with disbelief. Someone else had added another relative to the chat, widening the audience. The transaction sat there at the top of the feed, impossible to ignore. $1, my name, Daniel's name. The note I had typed earlier, simple and unmistakable. I felt a strange sense of relief settle in my chest. The first direct message came through from Daniel a minute later. He did not bother with pretense. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I did not respond. Another message followed immediately. "Are you trying to humiliate me?" Then a third. "You have lost your mind." I turned the phone off and set it down again. Within minutes, the doorbell rang. I froze for a second, heart jumping, then laughed quietly at myself. They were hundreds of miles away. Habit had wired my body to expect confrontation to arrive physically, loudly, without warning. I took a breath and let it pass. When I turned the phone back on, the volume of messages had doubled. My mother had left 3 voicemails already. I did not listen. My father had called from his cell and then from the house line. Daniel had switched to caps. Chloe went live. I learned that later from Emily, but I could see the notifications start to roll in even without opening the app. Tags, mentions, messages from people I did not know asking what was happening. Someone had posted a screenshot of the transaction. The story was already escaping my control. I expected to feel panic. Instead, I felt detached, like I was watching something inevitable unfold from a safe distance. For years, I had carried the weight of managing everyone's reactions. Tonight, I set it down. I began blocking numbers methodically. Daniel first, my mother, my father, aunts, cousins, the woman from church. Each tap felt deliberate, not angry, just necessary. I moved through my contacts with the same calm I used when cleaning out old files that no longer served a purpose. When the phone rang again from an unknown number, I declined it without hesitation. The silence that followed was not immediate. It came in waves, brief pockets between attempts. I used that time to secure the rest of my life. I logged into my social media accounts and adjusted privacy settings, restricted comments, removed tagging permissions. I disabled direct messages from anyone I did not follow. Each click tightened the perimeter. My email filled quickly, but I filtered it all into a folder I would review later with Mark. Nothing needed an immediate response. Nothing would change if I rushed. Around 10, my building concierge called to let me know there had been inquiries about me. I asked him to note that no information was to be shared and that no visitors were to be allowed without my explicit approval. He did not ask questions. When I finally sat down again, the apartment was quiet in a way I had never experienced. Not the tense quiet of waiting for the next shoe to drop, but a clean stillness that felt earned. I let myself read one message before turning the phone off for good. It was from my mother, sent minutes before I blocked her. "I cannot believe you would do this to your own family." I stared at the words, feeling the familiar tug of responsibility try to reassert itself. Then I set the phone down and stood up, refusing to let it take root. I poured a glass of wine and carried it to the window. The city lights glittered below, indifferent and beautiful. I watched people move through their evenings, unaware that a line had just been drawn in my life that could not be erased. Somewhere in Ohio, my family was spiraling. Daniel was likely pacing, shouting, crafting a narrative where he was wronged and I was cruel. My parents were probably fielding calls, telling their version of events, framing my refusal as a betrayal. I could imagine it all clearly. What surprised me was how little it hurt. The pain had already been spent in the weeks leading up to this moment. Tonight was not about loss. It was about consequence. Not mine, but theirs. I finished the wine and set the glass down, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. Exhaustion washed over me, but it was the honest kind. The kind that comes after a decision has been made and carried through. As I turned off the lights and walked toward the bedroom, one thought followed me, steady and unwavering. For the first time in my life, my boundary was visible to everyone, and there would be no pretending after this. I lay down in the dark and listened to the city breathe, knowing that whatever came next would not require my participation unless I chose it. That knowledge was enough to let me rest, suspended in the quiet, waiting for the morning to arrive. Morning arrived quietly, as if the night had not detonated anything at all. Sunlight filtered through the curtains and landed on the far wall, soft and ordinary. I lay there for a moment listening to the city wake up, the low hum of traffic, a distant horn, the muffled rhythm of life continuing without consulting my family drama. My phone sat untouched on the nightstand, face down, exactly where I had left it. I did not reach for it. That choice alone felt like a small victory. The days that followed were strange in their calm, not because the fallout stopped, but because it no longer reached me directly. Emily kept an eye on things from a professional distance, flagging anything that could affect the company. Mark handled the legal noise with the efficiency of someone who had seen this kind of pressure before. I stayed focused on my work and my routine, letting the storm rage outside the perimeter I had finally built. The story my family told did not improve with time. Chloe continued posting for a while, her tone swinging between heartbreak and outrage. Engagement spiked, then tapered off when there was no response from me to feed it. People moved on to the next spectacle. That is how the internet works. It demands escalation, and when it does not get it, it loses interest. The legal threats evaporated just as quietly. Mark explained that without my participation or signature, there was nothing to pursue. The letters stopped coming, the calls stopped ringing. Daniel's plan did not survive the attention without my backing. The investors he claimed were ready hesitated. The personal guarantees my parents had offered became a problem instead of a show of faith. Leases fell through, deposits were forfeited. The dream shrank quickly once it had to stand on its own. I heard all of this secondhand. A former neighbor mentioned it to Emily at an event. A mutual acquaintance brought it up casually, unsure if it was appropriate. No one reached out to me directly anymore. That silence spoke louder than any accusation ever had. My parents downsized not long after. The house I grew up in sold faster than they expected. My father took on contract work to cover what savings could not. My mother went back to volunteering more hours at church, perhaps to remind herself of who she was outside of being disappointed in me. I did not feel triumph when I learned these things. I felt distance. Distance has a way of draining emotion out of situations that once felt overwhelming. Without daily contact, without the constant tug of guilt and expectation, I could see everything more clearly. I could see how much of my identity had been shaped by managing other people's feelings. I could see how little room there had been for my own. Work stabilized into something close to peace. Northway Solutions continued to grow, steadily and responsibly. The chaos that had threatened to spill into it never did. My team trusted me more, not less. For drawing a hard line, I slept better, I laughed more easily. I stopped checking my phone out of habit. The most unexpected change was internal. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I could have said differently. I stopped imagining alternative outcomes where everyone understood me and applauded my boundaries. That fantasy lost its grip once I accepted that understanding was never the goal. Control was. One evening, months later, I found myself back in Columbus for a conference. I drove past my old neighborhood without slowing down. The streets looked smaller than I remembered, familiar but no longer magnetic. I felt no urge to stop. In my hotel room that night, I thought about the younger version of myself who believed that love was something you earn by being useful. I wished I could tell her that usefulness is not the same as worth, that being dependable does not mean being disposable. I did not miss my family the way I thought I would. I missed the idea of who I hoped they could be. I missed the version of us that existed only in my effort. Letting go of that was painful, but it was also freeing. It created space for relationships that did not require me to shrink or explain or perform. I built a quieter life after that. Not smaller, quieter. Mornings with coffee and sunlight. Work that challenged me without consuming me. Friends who showed up without asking what they could get in return. Evenings where the loudest sound was the city breathing outside my window. The dollar transaction is still there. I know because I checked once. Out of curiosity more than anything else, it remains exactly as it was, public and undeniable. $1, one message. A line drawn in a way that could not be rewritten. It was not the most dramatic thing I could have done. It was simply the clearest. Looking back, I understand why it worked. Not because it punished anyone, but because it removed ambiguity. It said everything I had been trying to say for years without inviting negotiation. It forced everyone involved to confront the reality that my success did not belong to them. And neither did my silence. If there is one thing I have learned through all of this, it is that peace is not something you are given. It is something you claim, often at the cost of disappointing people who benefited from you not having it. I do not regret the choice I made. I regret how long it took me to believe I was allowed to make it. If you have ever found yourself carrying expectations that were never yours to begin with, if you have ever been told that your boundaries were a betrayal, I hope this story gave you something to sit with. You do not owe anyone access to the life you built. You do not need permission to protect what matters to you. If this resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts or your own experiences. Sharing them helps more people feel less alone. And it reminds us that choosing ourselves is not cruelty, it is honesty. Thank you for staying with me through this story.